Hello, before I begin, I just want to point out I made an error in part one, so I just want to correct that before we begin. So in part one, I identified the Metropolitan Life Tower as being designed by the architect Cass Gilbert. It was not by him, it was designed by the architect Napoleon Lebrun. Both Cass Gilbert and Napoleon Lebrun are very important within this series, and I'll correct this later on, but just to address that issue first before we begin. Hello, this will be part two in the series in regards to New York and the Hermetic Code. I will put the link to, well, there'll be a few links in the description, but the link to part one will be in the description box so you can follow it. But the Hermetic Code, all sorts of names you could attach, but I'm just going to use this as the term, and it has very much to do with Hermes or Mercury or Thoth, as in Egypt. But if we do a quick review, through the series I'll be following a series of architects, and especially as they are connected to Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Oddfellows, and groups such as Theosophy. For instance, Harvey Wiley Corbett, he'll be one of the architects I'll be featuring, and so for instance I mentioned Bush Tower, in New York City by him, same height as the Sydney Masonic Centre, and I'll put the link to the description so you could basically just, rather than repeat it, I'll put it there. He also was the architect for George Washington National Masonic Memorial and the Master Apartment Building on 310 Riverside in New York. And just a review, so in the previous episodes I went into how, for instance, the Ghostbusters movie was an amalgam of a couple of buildings, one of them by Harvey Wiley Corbett, and the character Ivor Shandor mentioned there was actually an amalgam of Harvey Corbett and Nicholas Roerich, the famous painter, mystic and artist, who had some very important wealthy patrons, including Lewis Horch. Also detailed, like briefly, the importance of the numbers, of the measurements, how they connect to have basically hidden levels, and how they're not. For instance, 666 is not necessarily the immediate connection. It's got so there are a lot of connections in regards to that. But speaking of Theosophy and Nicholas Roerich, and so we'll go have a little bit of a tour again, and I'll be linking back to Sydney occasionally, but it'll be it's on New York, and it'll be a focus on New York. But the Theosophical Society was quite important, and there are links to that. So, for instance, the Path magazine, which was published here in Sydney, and they mentioned Helena Blavatsky, who was a key figure, one of the founders of Theosophy. And so the Path magazine published in Sydney, but one of the frequent contributors to the Path magazine was the architect Claude Bragdon, who in himself is quite an important character, and also, well, he was a theosophist as well. So even for instance, Wikipedia will mention how, even though he was a well-known theosophist, he still got quite a bit of work. He also wrote the foreword for this book by Ouspensky. Ouspensky was a disciple, protege of Gurdjieff. But Bragdon himself, very much into, well, geometry, but he wrote quite a bit and looking into architecture, but the fourth dimension was one of the key themes. And he was also quite a prolific illustrator, was Claude Bragdon. But this point of, well, and Rochester has strong connections to Claude Bragdon, but the fourth dimension, and well, in his writings and in his artworks, he really deals with this concept of the dimensions, but also of more mystical aspects of this whole field as well. But again, one of the key themes in regards to, you know, a square is in the second dimension, a cube is in the third dimension, and the tesseract is in the fourth dimension. And so these are one of the themes which he explored a lot. And I've put some links in the description now. I'll put one, for instance, where Carl Sagan talks about dimensions and the hypercube or the tesseract, and well, that's quite interesting as well. Excellent man. But also, I'll put a link to the description in regards to a video that I've made myself in regards to, again, four-dimensional, sort of connects to binomial theorem, but how the fourth dimension is underlying all these numbers which I repeat across the videos that I make. Also worth mentioning, especially in recent years, like such as in the Marvel comics and movies, the Tesseract was a repeating theme. And also, for instance, in the first Transformers movie, maybe in the second as well, I can't remember, but the Tesseract was repeated there. But also worth noting that the clothes he was wearing, apart from other references in the movie, are very much, well, entirely connected to Freemasonry. So, for instance, like the white T-shirt has the G, the moon, and the 7 stars around it. These are common symbols. They go back quite some time and sort of predate the modern formal system of Freemasons, but it's just an interesting point in regards to how it's worked its way into the culture. But back to Claude Bragdon, and to begin with, so Rochester in New York, and the architecture of Claude Bragdon. Now, he has some of his writings are stored in the library there, but like along with the Tesseract, one of his repeated themes and repeated throughout this whole field is the concept of the 5 Platonic solids. And I'll also put a link in the description where with compass and straight edge, how you can make your own. So, so for instance, in this particular illustration by him, he shows how cubes at different angles form sort of different shapes. And again, it goes back to this theme and how certain very important geometries are actually sort of it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of thinking in dimensions, and especially if as things tumble in the third dimension, a cube will have a different profile. Amongst his works, well, he also includes a quote from Kepler, and one of the more important quotes from Kepler is the importance of the Pythagorean theorem, as well as the golden ratio or divine proportion, or phi. Another one of Claude Bragdon's illustrations, the city of the frozen fountains. Well, a common theme through this is also the concept that music is geometry frozen in time. But so again, you can find PDFs in regards to that. But this is another Claude Bragdon illustration, and we have the baby, we have the man, and we have the old man. Well, this will connect now the Oedipus or Oedipal complex. Most people would connect it to the Freud's fascination with the mother. Well, it actually goes back to the story of Oedipus and the riddle of the Sphinx. And the riddle was, what walks on 4 legs, then 2, then 3? Well, that's part of the riddle. But also, so the Naxian Sphinx is the origin, one of the origins of the Ionic order, and Oedipus and the Sphinx and this riddle. Well, this will connect to that previous illustration in regards to Bragdon. So what walks on 4, then 2 legs, then 3 legs? Well, the illustration here is actually a reference to that. We see the baby walking on all 4s, the grown man walks on 2 legs, and then the old man walks on 3 legs, 2 legs plus his cane. And this is sort of certain themes throughout ancient history, especially Greco-Roman history, will be repeated throughout the people who are studying this, the sort of the masters of this particular point. Even lesser known ones such as Claude Bragdon base their, basically searching for the mysteries through these older legends. Now, I mentioned earlier Rochester in New York, and well, Sibley Hall. Now, these sphinxes have now been moved, but there we see Sibley Hall and where they originally were, and we see not the traditional traditional Egyptian sphinx, but more the Greek female sphinx. And again, this is another little connection to there. So, well, as I mentioned, Claude Bragdon was also a artist, illustrator, writer, and here we just see some of his artworks and designs. And so basically here it's like sly way of doing the unfolded tesseract. He also, for instance, the Greek columns, the Roman columns, that type of architecture as well, is also something he was very interested in, and he studied during his travels. So he would write about these, basically all the architectural elements, and hidden within the images themselves, but also the legends. There's quite a bit of knowledge in regards to this field. Now, another important point is that, well, for instance, the Temple of Man, but also how East and West connect, and that's something that I sort of explore quite a bit with the videos. But apart from that, he was, so there's sort of a more tangible elements, but so many of the people who study, who are into this, are very much into the mystical, the more esoteric aspects of that. But underlying all of this, really, mathematics is the handwriting on the human consciousness of the very spirit of, well, as the quote said. But so it's not just sort of, if you want to put it like intangible, it's very much based on measurable, testable things. And so in the architecture, measurement is very important, but it's also a combination with the symbols. Now, in Cutler Hall in Rochester, New York, for instance, you'll see these symbols here, and for instance, caduceus of Hermes, sometimes called the Kundalini, and the lyre of Apollo. Now, these are pretty much, you'll find them all across the world, but on the seal of the University of Rochester, there's a slight variation, because you have one snake going around, and that's actually a description of Apollo's son, Asclepius, or the god of healing. And so the double snakes and the one snake, actually they're different, so they get a bit mixed up. So for instance, on the paramedics will sometimes, or doctors will sometimes have one snake, they'll sometimes have two. Well, strictly speaking, the rod of Asclepius, the single snake, is the one connected to medicine. The double snakes are connected to Hermes, and he's just broader knowledge and science. But the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester. So for instance, we see the Zodiac wheel, but also you'll notice the owl. Now, in these designs, so of the architecture, you'll also find various symbols. Also, for instance, in Rochester, in the Rush Reese Library, Rochester was basically an early version of Silicon Valley, a very technologically advanced town. For instance, Kodak and had its, I think even IBM had headquarters there. But you'll see the legacy of this, well, in the technology, but also in the symbols. So, for instance, we have a Mercury statue, or Hermes, standing on Medusa, the Gorgon. Greeks called him Hermes, Romans called him Mercury, but Hermes is basically the origin of the Hermetic Code. But now back to New York City and Grand Central Terminal. The iconic structures in New York follow this same pattern, not just the older architectural styles, but this follows through to the most modern skyscrapers in New York as well. But for instance, we see Mercury, and we also see standing above the sculpture group above Grand Central Terminal, Hercules, Mercury, and Minerva. That's their Roman names. In Greek, they're Heracles, Hermes, and Athena. And these are very powerful symbols. They're loaded the legends and connections with them. We will see repeated across the world. Now, for instance, we have Athena also in Rochester, but you also find it, well, in everywhere basically. But also, for instance, the Zodiac. This is another a theme, like a hallmark, pointing us towards the structures which follow this particular pattern. Well, then we come back to Grand Central Terminal, and in the ceiling above the Grand Concourse, we see three of the zodiacs, but also we have a couple of other important constellations there: Orion, the Triangulum Major and Minor, as well as Musca the Fly, but really it's Apis the Bee. It was, Romans called it the fly, but in the Greeks it was more towards the bee, and that points us towards Aristaeus, who was the Greek god of animal husbandry and cheese making. Another point, so Well, okay, so in the QVB in Sydney, again, just as to show how we sort of go everywhere, we see the beehive. Now, the beehive symbol, it's different from agriculture because this is processing foods. This is an important point to remember. So we're moving away from, we're not just growing wheat, but Aristotle's more towards the science of food and how we would turn milk to cheese and how we can, take care of animals, beekeeping. But in Goulburn, Australia, which is a very hermetic town in itself, you'll also find this bee symbol going on in the streets, and it's connected to Freemasonry. For instance, lodges used to be called hives, and when a lodge would split, it would be called swarming. But for instance, in Oddfellow symbols, you'll find the beehive being repeated again. And think about bees as well as being very industrious, a very ordered, very peaceful society as well. And of course, it's you'll see it too often referred to in Freemasonry as well. So we have, as we've always, sort of multiple layers, multiple levels, multiple forms going on. This is one of the points in this particular style and this architecture. So we see the Zodiac being repeated in Rochester and Grand Central Terminal. I'll put the link to the description. I did a previous video. This is the AWA building in Sydney, but just as an example, inside the building we have a Zodiac with the full 12 of the signs. Now, that's the 12 of the Zodiac. There are actually 88 constellations, modern constellations altogether. Apart from other references in the building, we'll also see, Demeter or Ceres, the god of agriculture, but she's holding the cornucopia. That, as we come back to Grand Central Terminal, we'll also see, so on either side of a clock, we have the cornucopia or the horn of plenty. Now, it's basically, it's a symbol of plentiness, of a good harvest, of being a full belly, basically. Now, didn't include it in the AWA building, but this is final scenes from the Matrix building. Well, the Matrix was filmed in Sydney, but they changed. CGI. They made the scenes different, and in that particular shot, we get a glimpse of the AMP Tower here in Sydney, Australian Mutual Provident Society, founded by Masons, and there we see a comparison with the Matrix, but also the cornucopia symbol is on the sculpture there on the original AMP building. So there is a very strong, a very obvious connection between Oddfellows and Masons as well. Now, I mentioned the beehive in Goulburn. That's the AMP building in Goulburn, but there's the same statue group, but just it's a different style, exactly the same as in the AMP in Sydney, but the same style, but also just to show that the cornucopia, for instance, we see in the Oddfellow symbolism how the cornucopia reappears there. It's very much connected to this whole group, esoteric / occult organisations, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, Oddfellows, Theosophy, Druids, Foresters, and many others to mention. But we also saw Athena in the Rush Reese Library. Now, the owl, or sometimes Bubo, is the symbol of wisdom, but that also is what Minerva or Athena is. And so, for instance, back to New York City, in Herald Square, Minerva and the bell ringers, and we see this, the owl standing there in front of us. So like, unless you've got an eye out for these and you start to get into it, you'll just sort of walk past, you won't pay attention, you won't notice these. Now, back to Hermes or Mercury, this is Rockefeller Centre, 30 Rock, famous building. That was designed by Raymond Hood, and I'll be featuring him more and more throughout these series and how certain architects can connect. Now, you might have noticed he did not have the Freemason symbol on there, but there are Masonic connections. Now, the Manhattan Bridge in New York also had on the arch and colonnade, we also have a statue there of Hermes. But you also might notice that the arch and colonnade is shaped like a vesica, which is a religious symbol. The group, which is led by Crowley, incorporated it. But it's also, for instance, in this picture from a Masonic hall here in Sydney, we see how it's geometrically, symbolically, it's very, very important symbol. But while we're on the Manhattan Bridge, earlier I mentioned the Hermes Mercury on Grand Central Terminal. Well, the Manhattan Bridge is 120 feet wide, and the Grand Concourse beneath that constellation, beneath that Zodiac in Grand Central Terminal, is also 120 feet wide. But before I go into the numbers and the meanings and the measures there, we'll go have a look a bit more at the symbols. Okay, so back in Grand Central Terminal, the Zodiac signs in the roof, mentioned a bit earlier, but there are quite a few other connections here. So, for instance, we're in the age of Pisces, just about to enter the age of Aquarius, Aries 322, Taurus or Pleiades. But even though it's not pictured, what we're pointing at, so basically the center, what we're being led to is the constellation Perseus, which you've heard of Medusa, the lady with the snakes in her hair, turned people to stone. Well, Perseus killed her and he's holding her head. So Perseus with the head of Medusa, the Gorgon. And also in New York there's a sculpture of, well, there are quite a few symbols in regards to Perseus and Medusa in. So for instance, on the sculpture there we see the wings on his helmet. That's the same depiction as on Grand Central Terminal, the sculpture group there. However, the artwork of Perseus the constellation shows him with wings on his feet. Now, depending on which story, which version of the legend, but Perseus was able to fly because of the sandals given to him by Mercury or Hermes. So sometimes they talk about, in the movies, for instance, they have him riding the winged horse, and they've taken some liberties with the story. It wasn't until he killed Medusa that Pegasus, the winged horse, emerged from her body, like literally sprung from the hole in where her head once was. But it's a very important tale, and for a few reasons. Now, I've made a video on it. I'll put the link in the description, because what the story of Perseus is really telling is a story of the constellations. It's effectively making a star map of the northern hemisphere. Now, even we have Delphinus, Pegasus, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, quite a few. So anyway, yeah, the link will be in the description, because this pattern is, for instance, it's written into the streets of Sydney. It's in all these very important major capitals, but it connects us back to Rochester, where we began, because throughout New York State there are quite a few connections in place names as well. And so, for instance, we have the town or hamlet of Medusa, but Rome, Ithaca, Syracuse, New Lebanon, Canaan, Athens, the whole state has this sort of same pattern going on again, which is very interesting. And someone commented, so we have even in Nashville, which is another city very strong in this particular method. But back to earlier, Mercury is standing on the head of Medusa. Mercury with the wings on his helmet in this particular point. But across New York City, we have in the architecture, but we'll also have it in the sculpture. Exactly what's happening in Sydney. The art gallery in Sydney has these same themes running. The Flatiron Building, one of the landmark buildings, amongst other symbols, also features a Medusa. This is important because the building itself was designed by Daniel Burnham, who was basically the father of the City Beautiful movement of architecture. Now, very important all across America, redesigning street plans, very important buildings. And a building I'll get into, the Manhattan Bridge was inspired by the City Beautiful movement. But bit of a detour, so we go to West Virginia State Capitol building in Charleston. The architect here was Cass Gilbert. Now, the same. So in the dome, might not be immediately recognisable, but you will get a little bit of hint of that helmet. But as we go to the next shot, you might see the helmet. You'll see also the owl and the Medusa. So if we zoom in more. And also with a comparison to Brussels, how we have the helmet, the little owl. Now that's featured in that video, which I have the link to. But what's also important about there is how on the main entrances we have all these very key, very important gods, which, for instance, I've done some videos on Sydney and showing how this same thing's happening now, not just always in a single building, but across the same city plan. But that connects to, so for instance, we have the Grand Central Terminal, the sculpture group there. Heracles, Hermes, and Athena, or Minerva, or Mercury. Well, Mercury and Minerva, we also have there featured. No longer considered a constellation officially of the 88 constellations is the constellation Noctua, or the Owl. Hydra, Sextans, Crater, and Corvus are still there, and they also fit into street plans. For instance, I'll try and been planning it for a long time. Canberra here in Australia, which is our Washington, has his street map going. But Athena and the Owl and the Helmet. Now, Athena's the goddess of wisdom, but also of strategy and the defensive military. Ares is the god of war. Athena is the goddess of defense. But Bubo, the owl, the symbol of wisdom, and again, it's connected. So in the original story of Perseus, Athena is ordered to send her, or Minerva is ordered to send her owl, her wise owl, to help Perseus. Instead, she gets Hephaestus or Vulcan to make her a metallic copy, a mechanized copy, and send it. But back to, well, so this whole story around Perseus and these ancient legends form, amongst many other things, a star chart. And that sort of also will bring us back to, because it's a star chart focused around the North Star. Well, Orion, and as we mentioned, this is a Grand Central Terminal, but and the Great Pyramid is a recurring theme throughout all of this, because the shafts in the Great Pyramid, on the northern side, they literally trace the movement of the North Star, because the current North Star was not the North Star 1,500 years ago or 4,000 years ago. It slowly moves around. But on the southern side, the shafts from the Great Pyramid lead off to Sirius or to Alnitak in Orion's belt. We have Orion depicted there. Also, Taurus is there, which is very strongly connected to Isis, and Orion is very strongly connected to Osiris. These are Egyptian gods. Now, Aries 322, Skull and Bones 322, the 22nd of March is Aries. We are currently on the very tail end of the age of Pisces, just about to enter the age of Aquarius, and even these other symbols. So what's happening here is that there's sort of obvious knowledge, and there's also, it's pointing you towards something else, and that is Perseus. The links with Perseus and the Clash of the Titans are also hinted at in the Grand Central Terminal Zodiac there in the roof. Now, it's an interesting little part, but okay, I won't get into the apparent errors in it, but they're actually hiding some knowledge. But we see Perseus connected to Mercury, which Mercury is depicted on the sculpture group on top of Grand Central Terminal. Perseus cut off the head of Medusa. Perseus connected to the owl of Athena, which was Hephaestus or Vulcan, created a mechanical version. But sticking with the theme of Hermes or Mercury, we also find Rockefeller Centre is one of these key points in New York, and you'll find that there is a Mercury/Hermes depiction there, amongst many others. And one of the important ones is the great architect, as we see here: wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times. This comes from Isaiah 33:6. And it's a retelling of it. It's interesting because they've basically replaced wisdom and knowledge or reason with God. So in the biblical description, it could be read more as God is the Saviour, but here we see reason, wisdom and knowledge. Also in the Rockefeller Centre, we see this artwork, so the winged horse, the female holding the torch, and the eagle, which the winged horse Pegasus, the eagle represents Zeus. These, of course, are connected back to Clash of the Titans and Perseus, because in the movie it shows him riding the horse and then killing Medusa, but it's actually, he only got Pegasus once he cut the head off Medusa. Another key sculpture artwork there in the Rockefeller Centre is Atlas holding up the Earth, and we'll see, again, back to Grand Central Terminal and the Zodiac there, there are strong connections with this, because Atlas was condemned. Atlas was the father of the Pleiades, and I'll put a link to a video in the description, but he was also the brother of Prometheus. Now Atlas holds up the earth. He was one of the titans. He was condemned to do this by Zeus. We see Zeus depicted in that earlier picture, the eagle, and so we have these connections: Zeus, Atlas, the Pleiades, Taurus, and Prometheus as well. And this will be, well, throughout the Rockefeller Centre, this is a recurring theme. So just to go back, Pegasus, the winged horse, was released from the Gorgon or Medusa after Perseus cut her head off. Perseus, the constellation, is hinted at in the Grand Central Terminal. Atlas, Prometheus, all these things. But also in Rockefeller Centre, there is a very famous sculpture there of Prometheus. Now Prometheus brought fire. Basically, he's a god, one of the gods of techno. Well, he brought fire to man, and he was punished because of that. But another interesting point in regards to the Prometheus sculpture here is that the ring around it depicts the Zodiac, and this is a very important reoccurring theme throughout all this architecture, throughout all these symbols. And for instance, we have the Zodiac here. Now I need to, so the precession or the great year, so the precession of the equinoxes. On the vernal equinox or on the spring equinox, as the sun rises, there'll be a constellation behind that. So we're in the age of Pisces, and we're just about to enter, or we're basically in the middle period between the age of Aquarius, or the age of Pisces, and the age of Aquarius. Now the precession of the equinoxes of a great year, now these are very important, well, astronomical, but there's also numbers and hints to some deeper knowledge, and we'll see this reflected throughout the architecture of not just New York, but ancient architecture across the world. The discovery of precession goes back quite some time, and the numbers are very important to the sets of numbers, but also cycles of destruction. Please watch everything you can in regards to Randall Carlson. He really talks some really excellent stuff about this. But staying in New York, the World Trade Centers. Now these buildings are, the Twin Towers especially, are overflowing with this particular school of knowledge. Now there are a few other buildings there in the background, but anyway, the North Tower with the antenna is 1728 feet, which gives it these. So for instance, it's 2,160 Doric span. There are 2,160 years in a Platonic month, so each age is divided up into 2,160 years. The North Tower was 6,480 Doric palms. Each Platonic season or cluster of 3 ages is 6,480 years. 2,160 times 12 gives us 25,920 years of a great year, and the North Tower with the spire was 25,920 years. Now I'll break this down later because all of these connect so much to the Hermetic Code, but just as a beginning point to in regards to sacred architecture, sacred numbers, and how they connect with the Hermetic Code. So basically this is going to wrap up part 2. More and more coming. I'll come out very, very shortly, but just as rather than I'll be dealing more with the numbers, weights and measures, and how these architects, certain architects, very important iconic buildings in New York, are wrapped up in this school, this philosophy of as above, so below. So for instance, the World Trade Centers, the heavens precession is literally to do with the stars or the heavens, and they've projected it down onto Earth. Of course, there's a hell of a lot more to do with the Twin Towers and all these iconic buildings, and you'll see how each of these in one form or another come back to the same original source. These very important, very specialist numbers. Now buildings such as the Trinity Church, Manhattan Bridge, Grand Central Terminal, Woolworth Building, Metropolitan Life Tower, Metropolitan Life North Tower, and so many others, and you'll see how there is a cluster of architects who have repeated this repeatedly, to go forth. So anyway, this is the end of part 2. As above, so below. It's definitely a thing. It's written in stone. It's written in modern skyscrapers of concrete, steel, and glass. It's ancient system carried on through the modern world. So I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Part 3, and I'll require part 4. Anyway, New York, it's a thing. Have a good one.